Well, good evening, everybody. Good evening, everybody. You're in a funeral home, so always respond. All right? I mean, that's just the best thing I can share with you tonight. Make sure if someone says something, you say something back. My name is Pat. I'm really happy to be in Spencer tonight. I've been working with Andrew through the summer to help him on some of the behind-the-scene different things that he's putting together for you. He asked me to come up and do a program today, which we had a great group in this morning. You all look a lot smarter than the group we had this morning, though, so we'll do good. We'll do good. No. What I'm going to do as quickly as I can tonight is take you through 10 questions that we get asked at the funeral home all the time. Some of them at the start I'm going to spend a little more time on because I know from experience those are the things people want to learn about. A couple of them I'll go through pretty quickly as we move along here, and we'll get it wrapped up in under an hour. So probably a lot quicker than that depending how fast I can talk tonight. As I get started, whenever I talk on this topic, I always have a bit of a hope for every one of you who is in the room tonight. And that hope is that you would look at this evening as a starting point. It's great that you took the time to come in tonight, but if you walk out the door and you go home and you don't ever do anything with what you've learned this evening, you're not going to help anybody that you leave behind. So what I would really encourage each of you to do is sometime in the next couple of weeks, find a little time, sit down with Andrew and share with him as much or as little of what you'd like to see happen surrounding your funeral and your cremation. And the reason I encourage you to sit down with them face to face is there's not a seminar you can come to, there's not a book you can buy, there's not a web page that you can look up that's going to get your questions answered for you the way Andrew can answer them face to face in just a conversation. So that's what I hope all of you do at some point in time. So the first thing I want to go through tonight, what I'd like to start off with, is just the word funeral. You're going to hear me say funeral a lot tonight, and I want to make sure that when I say it, you know what I mean by it. And when I say funeral, all I mean is a gathering of people after someone has died. Now, that might be a very formal gathering. It might be an informal gathering. You might have it at your church. You might have it right here in this room. You might have it at your house. And you might not even call it a funeral. Maybe you call it a celebration of life or a memorial or a tribute. And what I would share with each of you tonight is that no matter where you hold it, no matter what you call it, you have some kind of a funeral. There are a lot of benefits that happen when we get everybody together in a room. And I know in the digital age, we don't do that as often as we used to, and I think that's not really a good thing. And if you think about it, you're kind of the hub of the wheel that connects your neighbors, your friends, your family, people you used to work with. And when we take you out of the picture, having that gathering lets all those people come together and start to form a new kind of relationship now that we're not going to be involved with it any longer. So that's just one of the good things that happens when you have a service. Now, you do hear people say from time to time, well, I don't want a funeral. And I let those people know I agree with you. I don't want a funeral either. No big hurry, okay, for that day to roll around. That's okay. But even if you're set that you don't want to have any kind of a funeral, I would encourage you to still come in here, have a conversation with Andrew because he still has questions and we still need answers to what's going to happen. So it's time well spent for you. The other thing that goes on when you don't have a funeral is that the people you leave behind are probably going to have one anyway. And they might have the kind of funeral where they get everybody together in the same room, or they might have the kind of funeral that goes on for days or weeks or sometimes even months at a time. And this is the situation where there hasn't been a service and someone comes up to you at church on Sunday and they say something along the lines of, was that your brother who died recently? And you say, yes, it was, and you kind of tell them the whole story. And then next week, a different person comes up to you in the grocery store, asks you the same question, and someone else comes up to you at the football game on Friday night. And those aren't really appropriate places to have those kinds of discussions. Having that service, having that get-together does a lot of good things. A couple other things real briefly on this is one of the things I hear from widows and widowers, here all too often, is they'll say something along the lines of, you know, the people that we used to do things with, they don't call me anymore. And that happens more often if there hasn't been a funeral. Because we see that person, we realize we haven't talked to them since, you know, their spouse died or whatever, and we think, well, I don't want to bring it up. Or we might say, I didn't know what to say to make it better. And what I would share with you tonight is there's no magic words. There's absolutely nothing in the world that you can say that's going to make it better. But at the same time, and I would encourage you, don't be afraid to bring it up. Don't be afraid to be a friend and just say, how you doing? And then listen. Because most of us are too polite. You know, if we've had a death of someone we care about, we think, well, we don't want to go on and on about it. We don't want to bore that person with the details. But when you ask someone, how are you doing, and you just listen to what they have to say, that does help make it better. Because being able to share those thoughts and those feelings with a friend is an important step as we kind of define ourselves now. We're a different person now once we've lost that special person in our life. So again, don't be afraid to bring it up. Don't be afraid to ask someone, how you doing these days? What do you think is the number one thing y'all checked on that pre-program survey? Any thoughts? How much does it cost? That's why I've got that slide right up at the start here. Not a surprise to me. I'm going to give you some pretty specific answers to that question, but I have a question for you before I go into this. What do you mean by a funeral? Because if you walk up to Andrew and you say, Andrew, how much does a funeral cost? That's like walking up to the Ford dealer and saying, how much is a pickup truck? Right? You can pay all sorts of kinds of money for a pickup truck. Do you want a new one? Do you want a used one? What do you want it to look like? What features do you want it to have? Where do you want it to take you? And funerals are the same way. So there's a range of answers to that question. But I did tell you I'm going to give you some pretty specific ones. So if you're going to take notes tonight, Andrew said go ahead and use the inside of that folder if you want to make any notes. And if you are taking notes, I have 3 numbers I'd like you to write down. Write down 6, 11, and 16. $6,000, $11,000, and $16,000. Those are average costs in this part of Iowa that people end up spending for a funeral depending on what kind of funeral it is that they want to have. So that $16,000 number, that's what we would call a traditional casketed burial. Person dies, the funeral director comes and gets the body, they bring them back to the building, they do the embalming, they bathe them, they dress them, they put them in whatever casket was picked out. We'll typically have a visitation or a wake the night before, funeral service the next day, and then we get in our cars and we all drive out to the cemetery and we bury that casket. The $11,000 figure could be a couple different things. That might be all the steps I just described, but instead of Andrew doing that with a casket, he's doing it with an urn. So we're still having a visitation, we're still having a funeral service, we're still going to the cemetery and we're burying that urn, but it's a little less expensive. Also in that $11,000 price range is something we call a simple burial. And I'll talk about those in a little more detail in a minute. But with a simple burial, we take an unembalmed body, place it in a casket, and then we bury that casket within about 72 hours' time. And then the $6,000 number would be more of what we call a simple cremation. We're probably just going to get together one time. Instead of having a visitation and a funeral, we'll probably just have what we would call a memorial service. Maybe not quite as many people there, maybe a few less flowers. And again, what I want to stress to you tonight is these are not the prices at Gielan Funeral Home. These are the average amounts in this part of the country that people actually spend on a funeral. It was important to Andrew to give you a very good idea of a starting point. And I'll share with you, because these are averages, you can spend less. And I checked with Andrew before the program. He said, anyone who wants to spend more than average, no problem, guys, okay? So don't feel like that's a hard, fast ceiling or anything there. But no, we wanted to just give you an idea. So could be less, could be more, but that's a good place to start. Now, when you talk about how much does a funeral cost, we need to talk about some things called cash advance items. What's a cash advance item? These are things that don't come from the funeral home. Funeral home doesn't make any profit on them, and the funeral home can't control the costs. These are things like catering, flowers, clergy honorarium, musicians, opening and closing the grave at the cemetery, death certificates, putting the final date of death on the headstone. All of those things come from other people. They don't come from the funeral home. But they all want to get paid either before the funeral or pretty quickly after the funeral takes place. So what Andrew will do under your family's instruction is he'll cut the checks. He'll advance the cash and pay all of those folks. So then your kids don't have to run around town. Your daughter puts the caterer on her credit card. Your son puts the flowers on his credit card. Andrew will put those dollar amounts on the funeral bill so your family just has one bill to deal with at the end of the day. And I want you to remember again, Andrew can't control the cost of these things. The caterer, let's say you hire Hy-Vee to do the lunch for you. Well, they're going to charge you the same to do that lunch, whether it's a graduation or a wedding or a funeral. Those are beyond, Andrew's control. The reason I wanted to talk to you a little bit about cash advance items is they can easily be 25 to 33% of your funeral costs. They can add up pretty quickly. And what do you think has happened to the price of cash advance items the last couple of years? Think they've gone down? No, they've gone up, kind of like everything else. So it's something you want to be aware of. Another thing is a document called a general price list. A general price list or a GPL. What is that? That's a form that the federal government says every funeral home in the country has to have a general price list. And on that price list, they have to disclose how much they charge for dozens of different things. Now you, as a consumer, can walk in the front door of any funeral home in the country and you could say, I would like a copy of your general price list, and by federal law, they have to give it to you to keep. You don't have to tell them your name. You don't have to tell them where you live. You don't have to tell them why you want that price list. That's your right to have that. Now, let me suggest what I think is a good way to get a general price list. Instead of just popping in the door one day at the funeral home, saying, can I have a copy of your general price list, grabbing it, getting in your car and going home and looking at it, just call ahead of time. And just ask, hey, is there someone on Tuesday morning that could sit down with me for a minute and kind of walk me through this price list? And a good funeral home like Elan's going to say, sure, come on in. We're happy because then you can share what you're thinking about doing. Andrew will put together an estimate for you so that you know if this funeral were to take place tomorrow, here's how much it would cost. So kind of one final thought on this topic before I move on to the next one. One of the most difficult things that can happen to a person is, let's say you go home tonight and we're all done with the program and you're digesting your pizza and you're settling in and the phone rings and it's one of those phone calls. Someone close to you just died. So then tomorrow morning, you're turning around, you're coming right back in here and you're walking in the door, you're not sure what you're going to do. You don't know how much it's going to cost, and you might even be kind of concerned, I'm not sure how we're going to pay for this. That's a really tough situation to be in. But what I would share with you tonight, if each of you spends about 2 hours in doing some planning ahead of time, Andrew will help you put together a folder so whoever it is that's coming in here on the day after you die can have that in their hands. And in that folder, it's going to tell us, here's what we're doing, here's how much it's going to cost, and you can even have a document in that folder that says, and it's all paid for. So that will never be an easy day, but you can make it be a little easier day by doing some of these things ahead of time, and people will greatly appreciate that. So let's talk about cremation. First of all, your local funeral home can provide cremation services to you. You don't have to join a cremation society or a burial association or anything of that nature. Every local funeral home can do this for you. If you're someone who's thinking about cremation, the great idea about making that choice is you have lots of options, you have lots of choices, and there's lots of different things you can do. But the bad part about picking cremation, you have lots of options, you have lots of choices, and there's all sorts of different things that you can do. It can almost be overwhelming sometimes. I'll share with you that about 40 years ago when I helped people plan a funeral, I really only had to ask them about 3 questions. I would say, which casket are we using? Because pretty much everybody used a casket back then. I'd say, which church are we having the service at? And then I'd ask them ham or turkey. And that's all we really had to know, and we were good to go. Because if it was a Lutheran service, this is how we were doing it. If it was a Catholic service, this is how we were doing it. It's not that way anymore. I think it's good that maybe it's not that way anymore. So let me walk you through some different things. Excuse me. To start with, cremation isn't the kind of funeral. And the reason I share that with you is because I do hear people say, well, I don't have to go talk to Andrew because I told my kids I wanted to be cremated. And I would respond to that person in a respectful way is, you really haven't told your kids anything. That's like telling your kids, I want to be buried. Okay, good to know, but what's going to happen on the day you die? What's going to happen 2 days later? What's going to happen a week later? So all cremation is, it's just a form of final disposition. Instead of putting the body in a casket and burying it, we're going to cremate the body and put it in some type of container. Anything that Andrew can do with a casketed funeral, he can do with the funeral that involves cremation at some point in time. So let's say you come in here next week and you're sitting down with Andrew and you look at him and you say, yeah, I think we'd like to be cremated. And then Andrew looks at you and he says, well, when do you want to be cremated? What are you going to say to him at that point? After you're dead, right? Yeah. Yeah. Andrew knows that, so why did he ask you that question? Well, he's trying to figure out, do you want to be cremated after the funeral? Do you want to use a rental casket or a cremation casket, have the body present and then do the cremation at the end? Do you want to be cremated pretty quickly after the death has occurred and then maybe have a gathering with the urn and some pictures, flowers, that type of thing? And I will share with you one of the nice reasons about working with Andrew is he does offer a third option. And here's my first homework assignment for anybody thinking about cremation. I would encourage you to ask the people you are closest to, would it be helpful for you to see my body after I die, but before the cremation takes place? And you might get different answers from different kids. Maybe you got 4 kids and 3 of them live in the area here. And they were all able to get there at or near the time of death, but maybe you have a daughter that lives in Milwaukee. She couldn't get back in time. And she says, yes, I would like to see dad or mom before the cremation takes place. Well, Andrew will bathe and dress the body. He will lay it out nicely, and that immediate family member can come in here, kind of say their goodbyes, and then the cremation can take place afterwards. So just want to let you know that that's an option. When it comes to cremation, you do not have to buy a casket. You do not have to be embalmed. You might end up doing one or the other or both of those things depending on the kind of funeral you want to have, but there's no law that requires it. And then likewise with urns, most people will buy their urn from the funeral home, but you don't have to if you don't want to. If you have a container of some type that might add meaning to that funeral, let Andrew know. He's willing to work with you to make that happen. Over the years, I've seen people use cookie jars. I've seen toolboxes, tackle box. I saw a Folgers can. One of the best ones I saw was 3 daughters. They took Dad's bowling ball and they hollowed it out. We put the cremains in there. We sealed it back up. We kind of cut the bottom so it would sit flat on the shelf, and that added real meaning for that family. So again, if you have ideas, please share them with us. We'll like to make you help to make that happen. So here's a question for y'all. We've done the cremation. We've got the cremains in a container. What are we going to do with them at that point in time? Or what do we do most of the time? Anybody have a guess? Well, you're a tough crowd tonight, aren't you?
Spread them out.
We could scatter them. What else might we do with them? Could bury them in a cemetery. Yeah. There's all sorts of different things we can do because the state of Iowa says cremation is final disposition. And beyond a very few things, they don't really care what happens, or they don't keep track of what happens with cremains after that is done. Now, in this part of the country, most of the time, we still bury them in a cemetery, just like we would with a casket. But you don't have to if you don't want to. If you want to, you could be made into a diamond. You could be part of a coral reef. There's a company that will shoot you into space. You could mix your cremains with soil and plant a rose bush or an oak tree or something like that. And then I always share with folks, there's a company where I live in Alabama that will load you into 12-gauge shotgun shells. And your buddies can all give you a 21-gun salute. So there's lots of different ideas and things you can do. If you're not sure what to do and you don't want to keep them in the linen closet or whatever, there are movable urns. You can get bird baths, sundials, garden rocks. You could make a little memorial garden in your backyard if you wanted to. Now in Iowa, we cannot scatter cremains on land or water without the property owner's permission. Okay, so when I die, if I was to be cremated, my wife could take my urn home and scatter me on our property. She doesn't have to ask permission. She doesn't have to keep a record of it. That's our land. She can do that. If she wants to scatter me on the 50-yard line or the 18th hole, after midnight is the best time to try that. And don't tell Andrew because he doesn't want to know anything about that. When it comes to waterways, we're supposed to be 3 miles from shore. That's impossible to do in this part of the country, isn't it? Does that kind of thing happen anyway? It does. Just, keep it quiet. Don't make a big deal about it. You want to think it through. Now, I'll share with you, I'm not against scattering cremains, but again, what we want to do tonight is get you thinking. And so one of the things you want to think about is if you scatter the cremains on your cabin land or your farmland, and then you sell that property, you can't go back and have a walk or talk with Dad anymore because you just gave up. You might not always have that farm in your property. So again, I'm not against it, but just think about these things as what you'd like to do. And again, come on in, chat with Andrew. You heard me mention earlier simple burials. When a person dies in Iowa, we have to do one of 4 different things. We have to either embalm them, cremate them, bury them, or refrigerate them. So with the simple burial, what we can do is we can take an unembalmed body, place it in a casket, and bury that casket within about 3 days' time. That satisfies Iowa state law. There are folks that don't like the idea of embalming. They don't like the idea of cremating. Well, we don't have to do either one. This is kind of a throwback to how our great-grandparents would have buried someone back in the day. This is a little less expensive than that full traditional funeral. It's our greenest option for people that are concerned about that. If you really want to go green, there's biodegradable caskets, different things. There's wicker caskets, things like that. So Andrew will go as far down that path with you as you feel is important to do. So again, just something we're starting to see more of. And we wanted to bring that to your attention. About 1/5 of you checked death away from home on that pre-programmed survey. So I'll just spend a minute going through this topic. Do you remember that old movie E.T.? Remember? What was E.T. trying to do? He's trying to phone home. You should do the same thing. If you're away from home and someone dies on that trip, your first phone call should be back here to Spencer. Call your local funeral home first. So let's say for a minute, I'm on vacation with my wife and we're in Phoenix and I die. My wife doesn't know the first thing about the funeral homes in Phoenix. She doesn't know which ones are reputable. She doesn't know which ones are expensive. She doesn't know which ones, specialize in this type of thing. She's been told, pick up the phone, call our funeral director back home who she knows and trusts. Let them call a funeral home in Phoenix to take care of that situation. Couple reasons for that. Number one, it'll save her money. Number two, it'll make sure someone's looking over her shoulder, making sure she's taken care of properly. Because if she picks up the phone, calls a funeral home in Phoenix, they're going to charge their regular retail rates. But if she calls our funeral director first and they call the funeral home in Phoenix, funeral homes have what they call courtesy rates, help keep those costs down a little bit. So if you're someone that travels a lot like I do, they do have a travel protection plan that's available through the funeral home. I know exactly how this works because I bought this exact same thing. Matter of fact, I have a tag on my briefcase that would alert people that if I don't wake up in my hotel room tonight, I would tell my wife, call Andrew if that happens, but just so you know. But anyway, how does this travel plan work? I gave them $525. I never have to give them another penny. Ever since I did that, I've been covered, and I'm covered for the rest of my life anywhere in the world if I die more than 75 miles from my front door, which I am right now. So the reason I got the travel plan is not so much for the monetary benefits, which are really good, but I got them for my wife's convenience. Because as I talked about just a second ago, I go back to my hotel room tonight and I don't wake up. If I don't have the travel plan, my wife is going to be on the phone for the next 18 hours. And people are going to be asking her all sorts of questions, and she's going to have to make decisions that she maybe isn't ready to decide yet. So the travel plan buys her some time. They will find a funeral home to come and get my body. It will pay for them to bring me back to their facility. It pays for the embalming or the cremation, because we got to do one or the other of those things. It'll pay for them to get all the paperwork together, because every state and every country has different rules and different laws. In my case, it will pay to have me embalmed. They'll put me in a shipping tray. It pays to drive me to the airport. They'll load me up. It pays to fly me back home, and it'll pay for my local funeral home to come and get my body. So if you do travel, ask Andrew about that. That's something he can walk you through and kind of explain a little more detail for you if you want. Real quickly, obituaries, vaults, and headstones. In the state of Iowa, there's no law that says you need to buy any of those three things. If you don't want to run an obituary in the paper, you don't have to. Okay, that's not a legal requirement or anything of that nature. If you want him to, Andrew will put that obituary on his webpage. So then if you have a relative that doesn't live in town, and they could go there and they could print off a copy if that's something they want to keep. When it comes to headstones, vaults, and all things cemetery, there's no state law, but every cemetery is free to make their own rules and regulations. And so an example of that would be when I came into town last night, I drove by a cemetery in north part of town, and you know, it's all flat markers there. There's no upright markers. Well, that's not a law. That's just a decision the cemetery made. We're just going to allow flat markers. Likewise with burial vaults. Most cemeteries will require a vault to bury a casket. More and more cemeteries are starting to require what they call an urn vault to bury cremains, but it's up to the cemetery to make those decisions. Andrew has a reference with all the different cemeteries in the area, what their costs are, what they'll allow, what they won't allow. So let him know, what cemetery you're thinking about using, and he can kind of walk you through what you can do and what you can't do there. I want to shift gears a little bit. I want to talk about funeral trusts and how these work in the state of Iowa. But before I even get started, Andrew wanted me to stress this next thing to you, and I would ask you, please share this with other people in town. You absolutely do not have to prepay your funeral to pre-plan your funeral. Andrew is not going to send you a bill for the time he spends with you, so don't let the money part stop you from coming in, sitting down, and having a chat with him. He wants to help you get started on putting something together to guide your family and kind of let them know what you'd like to have done. So no charge for doing that. And you heard me say prepaid funeral. In the state of Iowa, that's actually the wrong term to use. When you set up and put money into a funeral trust in Iowa, you are not giving your money to the funeral home. Okay? It's always your money. It belongs to you. The funeral home could burn to the ground. The funeral home could go out of business. It would have no impact on the money that you set aside for your funeral because it is not under the funeral home's control. And I'll kind of walk you through here in these next couple minutes to how this all plays out and how this all works. So in Iowa, and that's what I'm going to focus on tonight, how do these things work? There are 5 or 6 different insurance companies that operate in this area. These companies don't do anything except for hold funeral dollars. They don't do health insurance. They don't do car insurance. They just do funeral insurance. Then, Andrew has a fill-in-the-blank irrevocable trust assignment with Iowa state-specific language in it that outlines all the different consumer protections that I'm going to take you through here in a minute that must be a part of that agreement that is laid on top of the policy, and that's what turns it into a funeral trust under Iowa state law. So a couple of things I want to really make clear for you tonight. You either have a funeral trust or you don't. There's no kind of half funeral trust. You either have one or you don't have one. And in Iowa, there's no such thing as a do-it-yourself funeral trust. You have to work with a funeral director to set one up, but the funeral director cannot charge you for the time that they spend to do that, and you are under no obligation to use that funeral home at the time of death. So you have to work with a funeral director to set one up, but you can take your funeral dollars anywhere you want to. You're never locked in to a funeral home. And I did say you don't have to pre-plan to prepay, but I'll give you kind of my personal opinion on these funeral trusts. I'm pretty analytical. I love spreadsheets. I've looked at these things for 40 years, inside out and upside down. My personal opinion is if you're 60 or older, which I am, you should have one, which I do. They do so many important things and they perform so well at a very specific task. There's nothing else in the world that can guarantee you and your family that your funeral is going to take place this way, the way they can. So again, that's just my 2 cents. So how do these things work? First of all, wait, got ahead of myself. I have a question for all the women in the room tonight. How many of you own more than one purse? Okay? 40 years, that one's never let me down. Okay, why did I ask you that question? Well, I'm going to ask you another question. If you decide to use a different purse today, and you take your wallet and your keys out of the one purse and you put it into a new purse, it's still your wallet and still your keys, right? You just moved them. That's all you did. That's how a funeral trust works. You just move your money from wherever it's sitting now and you put it somewhere else where the government is going to treat that money differently than your other assets. So how do they treat it differently? So now I'll get back on track. First of all, it grows income tax free. So you do not get a 1099 statement. You don't have to report that increase in value on your income tax each year. At the time of death, the money passes outside of probate, typically available in 48 to 72 hours time. So this way your kids aren't coming to town, put the funeral on their credit card, and then they have to wait 8 to 12 months for the estate to get settled before they get reimbursed for that cost. If there's more money in the funeral trust than is needed to pay for your expenses, the money has to go back to your estate. The funeral home can't keep it. And someone says, well, how might that happen, Pat? Well, what is the one funeral expense that goes down the older we get? The lunch, right? Because there's less people that know us and come to the funeral. So let's say your family put aside $1,500 for lunch, and at the time of death, they spend $800. Well, that extra $700 then could be used for something else, or it would go back to your family. So the funeral home can't keep that extra money. So what's the other side of that coin? Wonder if you don't have enough money in there to pay for your funeral, right? Maybe prices really went up fast and your money didn't grow quite that fast. Well, I'll answer that question, but first I'll let you know there's usually never a big refund or never a big shortage. It comes in pretty close the vast majority of the time. But let's say you were a few $100s short of what your family wanted to do. Well, sometimes that happens because mom didn't put any money in there for flowers. And if we didn't pre-fund any flowers, we don't have any money to pay for the flowers, do we? That has to come from somewhere else. Maybe your family put down, or maybe you picked out a casket and your family needs to save a little money, so they maybe pick a little less expensive casket. So your family has the freedom there to do any adjustments that they may need to do at the time of death. Or let's say my dad dies and the funeral he wants, we're $300 short in his funeral trust. I'm more than happy to write out a $300 check because I don't have to write out a $9,000 check to pay for the whole thing. So there's some flexibility there for your family. The money is protected from creditors. So if you have a Citibank bill or a car loan or a mortgage or something like that, those folks can't go after the money in your funeral trust to help pay for those debts. It's also a protected asset against medical costs and nursing home costs. So if you were to fall ill, go into the nursing home, they can't go after the money in your funeral trust the way they could go after other assets to pay for that bill. And a couple other things, your file is your property. So if you want to transfer your file to a different funeral home, that's your right. 8 years ago, my wife and I, we moved from Minnesota to Alabama. So one of the things I did before we left is I went into the funeral home and I got my file and I took it down south with me and I visited, 2 or 3 funeral homes in the new place where we were living and picked out one and put it on file there. We made a couple little adjustments to it, but again, that's my right. It follows me wherever I go. And again, you are not locked into a funeral home. So if you set things up with funeral home A and any reason you want to use funeral home B, you have the right to take those dollars to any funeral home you want to. And I think, the best part about these funeral trusts for last, and that's this. You can change your mind and your directives anytime you want to. So if you write things down, plan things one way today, you want to change it later on, that's your right. Nothing is set in stone. Now, it's kind of a small picture, and it's on the bottom of the screen up there, but can anybody tell me what that is up there? You ever seen one of those before? What is that? It's a round to it. Thank you, sir. Or as they say where I live, I want to help all y'all get around to it tonight, okay? So here's where I'm going with this. Here's where I brought this up. When I meet somebody new, a lot of times it's in the airport, and we're sitting and we're talking, and they find out what I do for a living, they kind of say the same 2 things every time. The first response, the first thing they'll say to me is, you know what, that's a really good idea. I'm going to do that. But then they'll say something along the lines of, but those are some big decisions. I want to think about this a little before I write anything down. Coming from the Midwest, folks, what typically happens when we want to think about things for a little bit? Yeah. Absolutely nothing, right? It's just kind of a delay tactic or something. So please remember, you can change your planning at any time you want to. Andrew has a really nice 14-page funeral and cremation planning guide that he will order, he will pay for, and he will give one to you for free. Here's what I would like all of you to do. Before you go home tonight, ask Andrew to get one of those books to you. And when you get it, here's what I'd like you to do. Take it home, shut off the TV, put your phone down, and just spend 15 minutes filling out as much or as little of that book as you can. Because if that's all you ever do, I promise you, someone someday is going to be very thankful that you did that and kind of pointed them in the right direction. And if you answered a question one way today, and then a couple months you open that book up again and you don't want to do it that way anymore, you just draw a line through it and write in, maybe you don't want roses, maybe you want carnations or lilies or whatever. It doesn't, you can change it as many times as you want. Where do you think we see the most changes happening? Songs, Bible verses. Those seem to be the 2 that we see crossed out and a little different one wrote in, because maybe you were sitting in church one Sunday morning and you're like, oh yeah, I've always liked that hymn. So again, what the point to take away is you can change your mind anytime you want to. So plan it today as much or as little as you can. Your family will be happy that you did it. So I have 2 more things I want to hit on before I wrap things up. And I forgot to mention to you, when I'm all done here tonight, we're going to bring Andrew up front, and we'll take some questions at that point in time. So if you have things that I haven't touched on, please be ready to ask some questions. But this next topic, as I get into it, you might kind of wonder, why is Pat talking about this? What does this have to do with funerals? And if you stick with me, I promise you, I'm going to bring it around to funerals, and I think you'll see why I felt it was important to share this with you tonight. So as we get older, what's typically the biggest financial threat that we worry about? What's going to happen and where are we going to lose all our money?
Nursing home.
Yeah, I'm going to get sick, I'm going to go in the nursing home. It's something we all think about from time to time. Now, I knew I was going to be in Spencer on Tuesday, so this weekend I went to the American Council on Aging and I looked up the average cost for a month in the nursing home in Spencer, over $9,000 a month. That's a lot of money. And I don't know what that would do to your checkbook, but I tell you, it'd blow ours up pretty quick. And most of us know Medicare pays next to nothing for living in a nursing home. Health insurance policies, really, they might pay up to 100 days of skilled care if you're fortunate. You've got to have one of those long-term care insurance policies, but I'm not going to talk about those tonight. But this does bring me up to the pop quiz part of the evening. And I know you're all tired from eating pizza, but I need you to participate here with me now, okay? I got 2 questions for everybody. First question's a little tougher. Second question's a breeze, okay? So question number 1 tonight. Please raise your hand if you're going to live in the nursing home someday. Not even a maybe. All right? So remember I told you the second question's easier, all right? This time, raise your hand if you think there's a chance the guy sitting next to you might go to the nursing home someday. This is usually when the wives' hands all go up in the air. All right, let me take a quick time out before I go on. Putting someone you love in the nursing home is a really hard thing to do. I've had to do it. I bet you a lot of you have too. So please don't think I'm up here tonight, disrespecting that or making a joke, because I don't mean to do that. But what I'm trying to illustrate is pretty obvious, isn't it? This is kind of what we all think. It's not going to happen to me, maybe the other guy. Well, sometimes bad stuff happens to good people. And what you're looking at on the wall up there is about a 90-minute seminar. I'm going to spend about 4 minutes on this and go through this pretty quickly here. But if my wife is still living and I go in the nursing home, what the state of Iowa says that we need to do is on the day I entered that nursing home, we need to put everything we own into a pile. And we need to put a dollar amount on all those things. We need to add up everything we own, and we need to say, this is how much it's worth. So my wife gets to walk up to that pile of assets, and she gets to pull a few things out that she gets to keep, that the nursing home can't take away from her. She gets to pull out one piece of real estate. She gets to pull out one car. She gets to pull out her funeral trust if she has one, because remember I told you that's a protected asset. She gets to keep a certain amount of income, and she gets to keep somewhere between $50,000 and $160,000. There's a formula. It's not half. Everything else we own has to go over to my side of the ledger, and I have to do what the government calls as a spend down. I have to spend all of the other money that we have before the government's going to step in and help pay for my health care costs. And when I say everything we own, I mean everything we own. IRAs, 401ks, cash value in our life insurance policies. Maybe my wife owns a farm with her brother. Maybe I own a business with my sister. Maybe we own a family cabin or something like that. All of those things are called countable assets, and I have to make sure that whatever value I have in those things, I spend to pay for my care before the government's going to step in. Now, when I get down to only having $2,000 and my funeral trust left, Medicaid will begin paying our health care costs for us. Couple things. You notice I said I have to do a spend down. I can't do a give it away down, because of something called the 5-year look-back period. The government says in the 5 years before I run out of money and need to apply for long-term care benefits, I can't make any gifts to anybody for any reason in any amount. Zero, nada, none, nothing. And if I do make gifts, I have to get them back. So let's say my wife and I, we gave the kids, we got 4 kids, let's say we gave them $10,000 apiece 3 years ago, and I go in the nursing home, and within 5 years' time, I need government assistance. The government says, hey, Pat, get that money back from your kids. You think they still have it? Fat chance, right? If you got kids like mine. What happens now? Well, now I have to sign a waiver form. The government now has the right to go after my kids to get that money back. And they'll get it one way or another. And you know what, guys? It doesn't matter why we gave the money away. Could have been a very noble purpose. Maybe we gave some money to my daughter to help her with a down payment on a house. Maybe we gave some money to my grandchild to help him pay for college. Maybe we gave some money to our church to help above and beyond my tithe. They're not going to go after my tithe. I'm okay there, but maybe I gave a little extra for a building fund or a mission or something like that. Technically, that's a gift. And then the government's going to keep track of how much money they spent on my care. So let's say the government spends $100,000 taking care of me before I die. What they're going to do when my wife dies, they're going to present that $100,000 bill to her estate. And who do you think's first in line, the government or my kids? Yeah, government. And I'm not trying to make the government be the bad guys here, because we're all taxpayers, aren't we? And so, I mean, we're all paying for these types of benefits and programs, but it does seem unfair when you get caught in a situation like this. Well, here's why I talked about all of this tonight. 40% of the time, nobody sets up a funeral trust until after someone goes in the nursing home. Because we were going to think about it, we didn't get around to it. And let me tell you, if you had to put someone you love in a nursing home, the last thing you want to do is stop here and set up a funeral trust for them. It's hard to do on your own, and it's hard to do when it's a reality like that. Sooner is always better for these types of things. If you're married, it is so much easier to come in here and do this together when it's not something that's looming over a crisis or something. If you're single, widowed, or divorced, invite one of your kids to come in and do it with you. You can do it by yourself. You're smart enough. But sometimes just an extra set of eyes and ears is good to have when you're trying to make these kinds of decisions. I'm going to skip through this next one because I don't want to run any longer than I have to. I'm not going to go through all of these things here. Andrew can walk you through these when you're having a conversation about it. But the state of Iowa says you need to do 4 things to properly have a funeral trust. Have to have a contract with the funeral home, has to be itemized, has to be irrevocably assigned, and then the beneficiary has to be a funeral home, which you have the right to change that beneficiary. But he can get into more detail about that with you. Occasionally, I give this presentation and someone comes up to me afterwards and says, yeah, Pat, I don't need to do one of these funeral trusts because I figured out a way to beat the system. And it's usually a guy that tells me this because we love to beat the system. And hey, points to you for trying. But here's what happens. People think they're going to find a creative way to do this. And then what happens, they go in the nursing home, they're in a spend down situation. We have to undo what they did and then redo it all correctly. Couple examples would be, well, I don't need a funeral trust because I have a life insurance policy that'll pay for my funeral. Well, that might work. It might not work. Because with most life insurance policies, there's 2 values. You have a death benefit and you have a cash value, right? So let's say your death benefit's $20,000 and you got a $10,000 cash value in there. Does anybody remember if I want to go on Medicaid, how much money do I get to keep? $2,000, right? I'm $8,000 over the limit because I got $10,000 in that life insurance. I may have to cash that policy in, spend the money on my health care, and now what am I going to use to pay for my funeral? So again, if you have a small life insurance policy and you're counting on that to pay for your funeral, it might work, it might not work. I can't answer that question without reading the policy. So what I would encourage you to do is bring that policy in here now, let Andrew look at it, he can scan it, he can email it to our office, we'll do an analysis on it for him, and we'll come back to him with some suggestions for you about here's what you could do to protect that money. Another thing people do is they mix up estate planning with estate preservation. And a good example of that is a pay-on-death account. There's nothing wrong with a pay-on-death account. It helps you avoid probate. It doesn't do anything to protect your money from the nursing home. So let's say I went down to the bank and I put $10,000 into an account. And I named my daughter, Sophie, the beneficiary, pay on death. And I tell her, use this money to pay for my funeral when I die. She says, okay, Dad. So I pass away, she stops at the bank, she gets the money, she meets her 3 brothers at the funeral home, Guess who thinks she's in charge now? Yeah, because she's got the money, right? And she kind of thinks she's in charge all the time anyway. So that might not be a good thing to let happen. Maybe she doesn't even show up with the money. She doesn't have to. It's her money. She can do whatever she wants to with it. Or maybe she gets to the funeral home and she tells her brothers, Dad only put $5,000 in there. And she puts the other $5,000 in her pocket. Now, I hope she wouldn't do that, but I'm old enough to see those things happen. And you probably have stories too about things like that. So again, the funeral trust is the only thing that can guarantee that that money is going to be there and be used only the way you wanted it done. I want to wrap things up and I want to talk a little bit about families. Would it come as a surprise to you if I told you that sometimes families get in arguments at the funeral home? Probably not news to you. Maybe you've been in one of those arguments. I don't know. Most of the time they don't. You know, most of the time they pull together and they do a good job kind of getting along. But when it does break out, it gets ugly. And it's really kind of sad to see. Because what does every parent want? You want your children to get along after you're gone, right? Obviously. Well, you're kind of the supreme court of the family. And you're gone. And here's what I've discovered. Those kids aren't arguing about what 3 songs or what order they should be played in. They're arguing about something that happened 30 years ago. And they've just been waiting for this day. Well, if we've got your funeral all planned out, we can avoid some of those things happening. Or something else you could do. Let's say, like me, you got 4 kids. And you're like, oh, they're never going to agree on everything. Well, give one kid something to do. Tell one kid to pick out the music, one kid to pick out the flowers, one kid to pick out the Bible verses, and one kid to pick out the thank you cards or whatever. That way, you know, you're kind of giving them all something to do, but you're avoiding arguments there. And here's another thing that happens. I don't know anything at all about your families. You don't know anything about mine. But you ever notice how a lot of times you see a family and you got one kid who did pretty well for themselves. And then you got another kid who it's a struggle to pay the rent every month. Same parents, same household, just the way things worked out. Well, in my case, I do have one brother and I have one sister, and we're really fortunate. My mother is still alive. Matter of fact, she lives with my wife and I. But let's say my mom dies next year, and I meet my brother and sister at the funeral home, and we pick her out a $12,000 funeral. So we're all agreed on that, and my brother pulls out his checkbook, and he writes out a check for $4,000, because that's his third, right? And I write out a check for $4,000. And then we look at my sister. What happens if she doesn't have $4,000? How's she going to feel? Probably not real good in that situation. Might be a little embarrassed. Well, that's another reason we got a funeral trust for my mom, so we don't have to worry about that kind of thing happening. And I need to make full disclosure here. I don't know how, but my sister found out I tell that story at programs, and she wants y'all to know she's good for her $4,000, okay? So I'm not throwing Terry under the bus. She can cover it. So, and here's the last thing I want you to do. I want you to go home tonight and call up your kids and tell them you need $10,000 by Friday. Preferably small bills. So you got kids like mine. That ain't happening. That's kind of what happens, though, when someone dies, isn't it? All of a sudden, it's Friday morning, and we got a bill that on Monday we had no idea was coming our way. So let me share this with you. Andrew Geelan will never turn his back on your family if they can't come up with $10,000 in 72 hours. He's going to work with them and try and make things happen for them. But that doesn't erase the fact that now we've got a bill and we've got to pay it. And after going through all this, I hope none of these things ever happen to your family, but I think you can kind of see why I'm such a believer in these funeral trusts. They just serve the purpose. They make everything go smoothly. They make sure it all works correctly. And I just think it's a really good idea. So at the start of the program, what did I ask you to look at tonight as? A beginning or a starting point. And it'd be remiss of me if I didn't give you a way to get started on this, and that's with that planning guide that I talked to you about. Every single one of you in your blue folder, if you would open that up, and there was a piece of paper in there that'll say something like program evaluation or seminar evaluation or something. There's probably a little airplane down at the bottom of it. If you would take that piece of paper out and if you would do two things with us, we'd really appreciate it. First of all, Andrew's just getting started with this new funeral home. He'd like to do another program like this sometime within about 6 months. We would like any suggestions that you have for him. If you have an idea of a topic that you might think is interesting, a guest speaker you might like to hear, maybe a different place in town to do a program at, because some people don't like to come into a funeral home, anything at all you can share with us, we'll appreciate it. Second thing I want you to do with that is at the very bottom of the form, write down your name, write down your phone number, and tell Andrew how many of those books you'd like him to get for you. If you're a couple, you'll need 2. Each person needs their own book. He'll order them, and when they come in, he'll give you a call. And what Andrew wants to do is have a short meeting with you to get you started on them. So now your next question is what? How long is a short meeting, right? That's entirely up to you. If now is a busy time of the year for you and Andrew says, hey, John, I got your book in. When would be a good time to get together? And you say, boy, Andrew, I got 15 minutes on Friday. Let's grab a cup of coffee quick. Okay. Maybe this is something, though, that you know in the back of your mind, I should really get a start on this. When Andrew calls you, tell him that. He'll block out 45 minutes or an hour to sit down and have a really good conversation with you. Then when you're done with that, just turn it over, leave it on your table. He'll pick them all up afterwards. We'll see how many we need to order, and then he'll give you a holler. Or if you want to, if you really want to get something started, approach Andrew tonight or give him a call and just set something up in the coming days. Remember, you don't have to prepay to pre-plan. And Ron brought up a really good point today, and so I want to share this with you all. He gets credit for this. If you do want to talk about doing the financial part of it, there's a funeral plan for anybody. You tell Andrew how you want to structure the money if you want to get some things set aside. You can do a little bit every month. If you have, maybe you want to start out, just put $1,000 in there and you want to add more to it later, you can do that. You don't have to come in and write out a check for the whole thing, or you don't have to write out a check at all. But it's very flexible as far as the finances are concerned.